For 45 years, an Indigenous man named Brian Anderson has maintained his innocence after his 1974 murder conviction, insisting he was not present at the time of the killing.
They were persistent that they had witnesses. We have witnesses saying that you were there.
And you're saying I wasn't there?
That's right, I wasn't there. Like, I do know these people, but I wasn't with them.
This week, W5's investigative reporter Avery Haynes is looking into Anderson's lifelong claim of innocence. Good to have you with us on this story. But we should point out, this is not the first time W5 has taken a look at Brian Anderson's story.
This is the thing that's so extraordinary about the fact that this man, for 45 years, 4.5 decades, been saying, I did not do this crime. W5 did this story. A young Lloyd Robertson introduced it back in 1978 when he was in prison as a 22-year-old man. He's 63 years old now. At the time, his lawyers and the people who were advocating on his behalf were thinking this story may be the story that ends up changing minds and gets him an appeal. And it never happened. He stayed in jail for 10 years.
One of the findings that are coming into looking at his story is that they believe he was part of the reason he was convicted is because of racism.
So Innocence Canada, who's taken on this case and has now filed a kind of Hail Mary, last-ditch attempt at getting this case reopened, gives a whole bunch of examples of why this case should be reopened. There was no physical evidence. He had an alibi. There was a fabricated confession. But they also say that systemic racism is one of the significant matters that should be looked at. And what Innocence Canada says is you've got a man, an Indigenous man in Winnipeg in the 1970s. The only thing he was guilty of was being Indigenous.
Yeah, and if this sounds familiar to people, that's because you'll remember 2018, Ontario's police watchdog also released a report that found systemic racism in the Thunder Bay Police, stating racist attitudes contributed to poor Indigenous death investigations. First Nations chiefs have also called for the United Nations now to look at Canada's justice system because they say it is rife with racism. What did you find out when investigating Brian Anderson's story, and how is he today?
You would think, 45 years saying I didn't do it, you'd think he'd be filled with rage. He is the most gentle, soft-spoken. He's the guy who, when he speaks, you lean in because you don't want to miss anything that he says. He just wants to clear his name, even though he's out on, he's out. He's not in jail right now. He's spent 10 years. He's on parole still. So he has to get permission to even go back to his reserve, which is 300 kilometers outside of Winnipeg. He says, I'm like a dog on a leash. He's got 100-kilometer radius around Winnipeg. He needs permission to leave.
It's an important story to take a close look at, and, an example of what we are hearing more and more of as, cases where things need to be re-examined. Avery, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks so much.
All right, and you can watch W5's Breaking Free this Saturday on CTV. It starts at 7 o'clock Eastern, 4 o'clock Pacific.